Good evening, thanks for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce the last of the events relating to the Reconstructing Space exhibition and accompanying book, which comes down next week. The last of these events is a combination of a short artist's talk. Thomas Demand will show us some of his work in the form of slides, and then Greg Hilty, who's the Director of Arts at the London Arts Board, and myself as curator of the show, will sit and hopefully take questions as well as discussing some of the issues which emerge from Thomas's work and more generally related to the exhibition and some of the essays written in the publication. First of all, I'd like you to welcome Thomas Demand.
That's a classic one. I don't need that. I have a thing here. So I'm going quickly through most of the work of the last 4 or 5 years to give you a little overview what the work is coming, where the work is coming from, what I want with it, and why I'm here tonight. So I'm German, as you might assume already, and I studied at Düsseldorf in the late 80s, studied in Düsseldorf in Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, and then went to Goldsmith College in London. That's my education, and from then on I moved to New York, and now I'm living in Berlin most of the time, whenever I stay in London for a year now. I started out as a sculptor and intended to make little sculptures, like little daily objects, which I don't have to store in my apartment or anywhere, because as a student you don't want to be bothered by the work you did already. Just want to go forward, so I made little things out of very ephemeral stuff, like mostly paper, cardboard, balloons, sticky foil and stuff, and developed that one forward a bit into just kind of limiting myself more or less into one material, and developing bigger installations or interior spaces. By doing that for 2-3 years, I started to, I never documented it at that point, and I just realized that they're falling apart, they bleach out, and I had to throw them away and didn't have any record of what I did so far. So what I decided was to kind of photograph them, and when I started photographing them, the results were in the beginning very disappointing, because I never got the formal idea or the thought and the proportion and all those kind of things which interested me in the first hand. I never saw them on the photograph afterwards. So as I never have been trained as a photographer, for me it was easier to change the actual model in front of the camera than getting used to the requirements of the camera. And that was basically the beginning of the work you're looking at now. I started kind of setting up the camera first, and then doing everything in front of the camera from a point of zero. And by doing that, I reversed the whole process of photography, but not in a very grand way, just because of practical requirements, which means that normally you go out with a camera and you photograph something which has been existing before you went there. And in my case, I just put the camera there beforehand. Nothing was existing in front of the camera, and I created everything then. This is a later work. I'm going through backwards and forwards a bit, but it has a reason. So this is called Studio. It's a work of the last year. It's basically the situation. What we have here is a panel. Just the original photograph I'm depicting here is the original source material. It's coming from a quiz show we had in Germany. Was actually the longest ongoing quiz show in German television, of a person who asks for a profession. There's a quiz panel of 4 people which have to kind of find out by questions to the candidate. He's only allowed to say yes or no, and it's therefore the most simple setup you can imagine for a quiz show. And I just liked it because it's very simple, a very simple setup of a panel in front of you. You have like 4 chairs. It's like the background is very simple as well. It's very straightforward. There's no frills, and as the whole thing was in the beginning, it was black and white. I had to translate it into color photography, which I never used black and white so far. So it's color photography, and I just, as it was like, as the background had like a range of gray lines, I kind of decided to do something which reminded me on the test image of a photograph, or like on op art paintings, Vasarely and Lose and stuff, like this whole tradition of painting. This one is another one which is a hedge basically, which isn't depicting any particular setting. This is called Barn. It's like kind of fell out of the frame a bit. You have to neglect the white stripe on the side. This one was in the show at Victoria Miro Gallery, but it was a complete coincidence that I made a piece about the famous photographs of Hans Namuth, who photographed Jackson Pollock at a certain time working in his studio, and I wanted to reconstruct the space Hans Namuth was picturing, which is the barn of Jackson Pollock's studio, being Jackson Pollock's studio, and try to reconstruct, to revitalize a crucial place in modern history of painting. That's called drafting room. It goes back to, as you can kind of assume already, it's very often I depict imagery you can find in newspapers, which you can find in archives, in media in general. So I hardly kind of invent anything. I just take a photograph, I reconstruct a space in large scale. So the chair you see on the photograph is basically life size. Everything what you see is in a very like 1-to-1 proportions. This drafting room has been the main office for the Wiederaufbau in Munich after the war, when an old retired architect, Mr. Richard Vorhölzer, was in charge to organize the city planning of biggest parts of North Munich in a standard which was supposed to be, kind of carried out by Bauhaus ideas. I'm coming from Munich, so my grandfather was what we call Oberbaurat, which is the guy from the city. So he knew Richard Vorhölzer very well, and he kind of, they were sitting like dealing and wheeling about the reconstruction of Munich. On the other hand, I grew up in a little village where the post office has been done by him before the war, and all those things you find out by kind of doing a bit of research where the photograph comes from. And the reason why I found the photograph is mainly because I wanted to have a space where things are developed and where things are kind of projects are developed, and not anything is where nothing is kind of produced or something. It's more like where idea is created and carried out. But I didn't want to have an artist's studio in this case. This is an earlier piece than the Jackson Pollock barn, actually. It's 96. That's the first one of those interior spaces. It's also life-size. It depicts basically a bunker. It doesn't look like a bunker, but it's like barracks in Poland, where the only significant force against Hitler coming from the institutional side in Germany, is an officer who tried to kill Hitler in the Wolfschanze, which has been the complex for planning the war at that time, planning the where the troops are moving to. And they all were leaning over the table, and he had a little bag with a bomb and put it next to the table. And it didn't kill Hitler because the table was kind of very solid, obviously German oak. Anyway, the thing why I kind of thought about doing that is reconstructing that one, and that's, as I said, that's the first one I did in that kind of way, was because I grew up in school books you have all this every German schoolboy looks at this image like at least 50 times, because it's the only the only proof that there has been another German behavior than marching with the Nazis. So this is for a crucial kind of element of education in post-war Germany. On one hand, on the other hand, I'm the result of it. So if the education works fine, it should have had some impact on me. But on the other hand, you just have it in the memory. You just kind of, it gets more and more fictional in that, because I, basically don't have any, like straight link to that. It's just history for you as well. And the older you grow, the more like the whole thing becomes a mythical space. And as I have seen the space so often, and I thought everybody should know it, or would know where it comes from, but it wasn't the case. Never anyone recognized it actually. This is a very dry one. It's called Pegboard or Panel, depicting not a specific site, as you can see, but referring to a lot of like a tradition of image making, which is ending up in op art again, or like if you want to trace it down to Fontana or something, or Opalka. There's lots of links, but they all have to do with painting. And if you want to, in my opinion, if you imagine this one like nearly the same size on the wall, it's kind of shifting in between an object and a representation of an object, which my work is about very often anyway. They shaked a bit like this. Again, the white stripe isn't intended there. This is a hotel room. It's coming from an American newspaper. It's a hotel room where Ron Lafayette Hubbard was writing his books for Scientology Church. He was living 3 years in a hotel room, and what I liked very much about it, besides the fact that it's Ron Lafayette Hubbard, who founded a religion and basically had to make people believe, is that in this room everything happens. So the guy lives there, he sleeps there, he writes there, he works there. Everything is like a little container or something of life. On the other hand, as with my kind of awkward privatization of images, it's like completely, every livelihood is like completely removed. It's very kind of pristine, backhanded. It's kind of just giving the impression something happened there. But what happened there is obviously not what Lafayette was doing. What happened there is what I did. There's another one, is Corner. It's Bill Gates' room in college when he founded Microsoft. The guy, he after founding Microsoft and not knowing what to do with all the millions, he started buying pictures, because he thinks that the pictures are the oil of the 21st century, which I find rather interesting. So he's buying, for example, the whole, the estate of Ansel Adams, but only the electronic rights on them. With all the pictures he's buying, he's only buying the rights for the electronic distribution, because he realized that you have to kind of put something into the internet on the long run to keep it interesting, because nobody wants really to read something. So the ideas about the internet he has require a lot of material he can kind of for entertaining, which is Ansel Adams, for example. Ansel Adams, on the other hand, makes photographs, black and white photographs of desert landscapes in Texas and in whole America, North America and South, like Mexico as well, New Mexico, and was kind of setting up a school of extremely well-developed black and white photography, where every detail is extremely sharp, which is an absolute contradiction to the reproduction of pictures in the internet, because you're kind of limited to the pixelation of the screen. But on the other hand, they have to sell that, those rights, the estate of Ansel Adams, to keep up and to finance the how do you call it, die Forschung, like research of Ansel Adams' estates, and keep his thinking alive. Why I'm telling you this is because I again thought, with my kind of recapturing photographs from which other people made, I could possibly try to find a private way of matching this collecting images by other people, by kind of taking over his image or his past as a photograph, pictured in a photograph. This is a corridor. It's basically, I saw a photograph in another newspaper. I saw a photograph of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, and it was a very blank IKEA-like setting. I thought that would be very interesting, and I went to America, and that was while I was living in New York, and I tried to find photographs, or better photographs, more source material, to find get more details, more stuff to work with. Unfortunately, they didn't allow anyone to photograph inside. It's this one photograph I saw. Nobody knows where it comes from, and I couldn't use it. I saw it in a magazine. Unfortunately, I didn't do some clipping because I thought it's public, and I could get hold of it anyway. By trying to find that, I'm a bit kind of lost at the moment where it was. I think it's in Milwaukee or something. I went there where the whole thing happened, and the apartment house isn't existing anymore because there was a raising tourism to go to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment house. So they just turned the whole building down. There were no photographs no reporters were allowed to go into the apartment. So everything you could find in media, in archives and press archives, was only footage from the floor, from the corridor, where with a police, with a little line saying police do not cross. You saw only a normal kind of corridor of apartments, and I realized that it's much better anyway, because I'm not really interested in the anecdote of Jeffrey Dahmer or in the brutality of his killings or anything like that. I'm interested in the fact that we all are confronted daily with representations of our surrounding which become important for some reason, which basically the society decides are not good, like murder. And oops, what happens with the slide? Is it running? Oops. I go forward then. So that you're confronted with representations of settings and places every day, and you just try. I try to kind of get. Not control, but find a way of dealing with this flood of images, and try to find out what, besides the fact that it is a news story or whatever story, why it is delivered into the newspaper, what's really pictured on those photographs, or the other way around. I hope maybe this naive idea that you can jump into one of those photographs and just, it would be real in there, or something like that. Basically, the fact that it's all paper is kind of bringing you back to that the photograph has been printed on paper as well, and it's just all reduced onto one material. And this, I'll go backwards. This is a piece I made in, when was that? 3 years ago or something, 3-4 years ago. It shows the Stasi office in Berlin. The peaceful revolution, if you maybe you remember, there was never any killings or any riot or anything like that. But the first thing when it really became apparent that this is an unreversible process was when they stormed the Stasi archives, the Stasi offices, to recollect their files. And that was when the order of the state completely collapsed then. So everybody stormed into there and wanted to kind of get their files, and that's what went through the news then afterwards. I like it, of course, because the file's made of paper, the whole thing is made out of paper, and it kind of, had a nice pun on that. This is a film archive. The source material in this one would be Leni Riefenstahl's film archive, or her film Olympia. She wasn't allowed to show it for a long time, so she stored them in Starnberg, which is south of Munich. I basically wanted to do a kind of a storage or an archive or a library or anything like that, but it's every photograph I was working with was always way too meaningful in terms of a library. It's always poetry, art, whatever, but it's knowledge all together, and then you have a huge kind of heap of meaning before you started doing anything. And in this case, you have boxes which are basically containers, and it's very simple. It could be a designer pizza, or it could be, in this case, a film archive or something like that. But it leaves you a bit. It leaves some space for imagination. So now we come to the architectural department, which is this is a diving board. This is also one of the first pieces I made. Is a diving board which I just kind of tried to reconstruct from my memory. This one is the one we went to school, but basically I wanted to kind of try to revitalize images you carry, Platonic images of places, architectural sites, which you kind of carry around in your memory, and which don't have to necessarily to match an existing setting or anything like that. That's another one. That's the staircase of my school, but it doesn't really matter whether it's my school. Everybody knows those architectural elements. It's a car park in Chicago, which I kind of built a model of. It's you might know the 7 or 8 unrealized projects of Mies van der Rohe, and there's a concrete office building from 1922 which has nearly the same structure, only reversed on the sketch, and has in the end the same proportions. Mine is much shorter and much more banal, but the whole, like the setting, how it's built up and how it's coming together, is exactly the same. This car park stands in Chicago, exactly opposite of the hotel where Mies van der Rohe was living for a couple of years when he moved to Chicago to teach there. This is the Brenner Autobahn. That's the highway we're using in Munich to go to Italy. So 3 garages. That's not a memory collected picture. It's one which has been shown in a magazine, because they found plutonium in the middle of those garages. It's balconies. Typical Berlin thing. They kind of in West Berlin they kind of turned the whole city down and made like really nice 60s buildings up there. In East Berlin they didn't have the money to do that, and they needed a building, so they kind of put down all the decoration and stucco and everything, and attached very similar balconies on every building. Which kind of, as I'm living now in Berlin, when I wanted to do balconies, it seemed to be the easiest. That's the sink, as you can see. It's a friend's dirty dishes. This is reversed, unfortunately. Well, this is a bathroom where the source is again of a media cover, photograph from the cover of a magazine called Stern in Germany, where a politician killed himself in a bathroom, or at least it was supposed, it should look like he killed himself. The main thing why I kind of dare to do that, it's always like a backwards and forwards, whether you really want to do it or whether you think it's kind of pointless and you kind of take another person's fate into your photograph, is first of all, if you think of the death of Marat, you have a very famous example in art history. On the other hand, this photograph has been printed on the cover of the magazine, and when the reporters which found him in the bathtub took the films to the post, sent it to the magazine, and the magazine printed it, and then they called the police. And that raised a huge scandal, as everybody can imagine. Whether the press can kind of, doesn't have the press the obligation to, the ethical standards or something, what you can do and what you can't do. It was a very interesting discussion in society whether you can. Now it's standard, everybody does it. But at that point it was a real taboo to do that. I just have to give it a bit of break because it's kind of burning down. But coming back to the bathroom you just saw, it wasn't clear whether it's a suicide or whether it's a murder, and the whole inquiries about this thing went on for like 10 years or something, until last year they kind of finished the whole process, and it's still not clear whether it was murder or not. But the state attorney in north of Germany, who was responsible for that, basically had to go back with the film to the hotel and reconstruct the whole thing, the whole setting from the photograph, because the photograph, they were the only unspoiled evidence, because after that the hotel people went in, the Swiss police went in, didn't know what to do, and the press went in again, and there was no reliable evidence for what happened really in there. So the role of photography kind of has been carried through the whole process of discovering or not discovering what really happened in this bathroom. Oh no. This one is a parlor. The magazine of the New York Times invited me to contribute something to a special issue about the Disneyfication of Times Square, because Times Square has been bought completely by Bertelsmann and Disney to refurbish it and clean it up. So instead of going there, I asked the New York Times, which basically gave the name to the Times Square when they moved there in the 20s, I asked him to send me, to make a blacklist of all the things which have to go, which is the pawn shops, bad cinema, you know, like adult cinemas, then homeless people, all the stuff which has to go, massage parlors. Make a list of those things and send me all the footage they have in their archive with this. And they did not want to send me all that stuff because it was like 15,000 images. New York Times is one of the first papers ever printed photographs in newspapers. So they have a huge archive, they're famous for that archive, and they were kind of very important for raising such a idea of social reportage, like VG did it or something like that. So I was interested to get their version of what has to go from Times Square onto my picture. I then asked them to kind of send me everything from the 50s onwards, because I didn't want to do a historical shot really. And they sent me this one, which shows a massage parlor in 72, where they had the same kind of campaign of cleaning up Times Square already when Ed Koch came into position. Was without success or anything like that, but it's basically showing very well how the social reportage, how much that is a kind of a setup. If you elevate the camera from top and you photograph down there, and you just give the viewer the idea that this is how dirty is the place. But this whole thing is a fiction. This construction is as much as a fiction as anything else in this. This is another one which is also flipped. You shouldn't kind of. It's called Window. It's last year's. It's a lawn. This is called Terrace. That's the first one I did from a private source. I asked our former neighbors to give me their photo album, because I didn't want to kind of trace down my own history, so I just wanted to have it a bit kind of detached. I asked them to give me the photo album of the 70s, and they gave me the photo album, and they had those garden parties I remembered very well on. I just tried to, to recreate one of those parties. My brother, in the original photograph, my brother is just walking in. And this one is the last one, which is a project where the Tate invited me to do a project in their project space, which I decided to do a moving image, to move the camera for the first time through a model instead of photographing a model which I built in front of the camera. It has been originally a 35mm film where you drive through an underpass very fast, and as soon as you leave the underpass, you're ending up in a complete blackness, and then the entrance of the underpass appears again from the right-hand corner down there out of the black, and you go in there again and again and again. It's a loop. It's like several drive-throughs. It's not really a loop of one drive-through. It's like several drive-throughs where you go through the same thing, through the same architecture, but it changes by watching it. So there's an entrance coming from the right-hand side where the door is, for example. The light changes, the camera position changes, the speed changes, all those elements of what you can do in such a limited and really simple surrounding. I try to make a variation from, and then it's basically an animated image what you watch. So that's it. That's what I wanted to show you. And now I think we should. want to sit here?
Yeah.
Oh! It's waterproof, isn't it? God, notes.
That's fine, Andrew. Thanks. Thank you, Thomas. Perhaps a good starting point would be for me to talk briefly how, in the process of researching the exhibition and the book, and many of the exhibitions that I looked at prior to doing this, which related to German artists using photography in relation to architecture, the emphasis was almost primarily on the Düsseldorf Kunstakademie, which was where Thomas did his first study, but specifically related to the school of Bernd and Hilla Becher. Their students are well represented in the exhibition and are some of the best known of artists using photography who have emerged from Germany in the past 20 years. But Thomas comes from a quite different generation in that whilst he was at Düsseldorf, as he's already referred to, the fact that he's actually studied sculpture under Fritz Spiegler. And what I wanted to ask you to explain a little about was the academy process in Germany, because it strikes me as being quite distinct from that in this country in terms of art schools. Having spoken to Becher students, it's quite clear that the process of education is very specific under him, in that the alternatives, the routes which they should follow are quite controlled, quite constricted by reference to his teaching. Very small classes, very limited access even to the master, and the rubric under which their work is made is quite controlled. Clearly, looking at Spiegler's students, that's not the case. They vary from Thomas Schutter through Thomas and Christine Erhard, who's also one of the people represented in the show next door, who makes the collage pieces, which she then rephotographs. But again, she emerges from a sculptural history. What specifically is it about? I mean, you've studied them both in London and Goldsmiths, doing an MA. But in Germany, was the Spiegler course in a similar way as constricted and specific?
It's a complete different idea. The Mr. Fritz Spiegler comes from basically from a tradition of like doing everything artists from the early 70s, like Dieter Roth, for example, as well. And he did like films, he did poetry, he did books, he made sculptures, he made paintings, drawings, like everything you can kind of think of. So his students can have complete freedom in their approach, whereas Becher's students have to be a trained photographer before he picks them. And if you go to the annual show and have a look at the work, I have to say that Becher's shows are most of the cases very monocultural. So you just have nearly everybody works in series. Like you never have a single picture. You just work in series. You just depict something. So somebody is taking photographs of tractors. One is photographing prostitutes. But it's always like this idea of a survey where you kind of find a hidden truth by rephotographing basically the same thing again and again, which is absolutely okay. It's just like if somebody else wants to enter it. If in the beginning I just had naively enough, I went up there and I thought, like get around the disappointment of not recognizing my sculptures on the photograph I made. I might get a useful hint or something. There's no way that you don't. They think they kind of own the Graal and they don't want to have anyone come close to it. So Spiegler's system is like he's working in the academy, and he develops with the students. He sees them like 2-3 times a day. He's there all the time. You don't have this pressure of like showing your work once a year, something like that. It's a continuous process, and he thinks what his role in the whole thing is to take responsibility for the first 2 or 3 years of the work, instead of the student. That the student can kind of develop something in complete freedom, but it's a very tense way of approaching things as well, which you find out when you leave the academy afterwards. So you have to imagine academies in Germany have a system of masters and students, so you have like 30 people in one class. Like grown-up students choose their master instead of being chosen. So you go there for example, I went to Düsseldorf because of Schwegler, and I wanted to kind of study with him because he has a certain tradition of things which interested me, which is, as you say, coming from Thomas Schütte through Katharina Fritsch and Martin Honert, to me, for example. And then that was very interesting, besides the fact that I wasn't there at that time, but it was very interesting for me at that time to go there and be part of that, and kind of, because I didn't know whether I want to do painting or sculpture, whatever. I just kind of started doing those little ephemeral things which I didn't want to be bothered with as I started. And you have lots of classes like that. You have a Richter class, which is a bit more limited in the approach, and you have now it's Jeff Wall is going there instead of Bechers. But you have like real masters in the Düsseldorf Academy, and that made it so exquisite in the 80s, because it's not a political vehicle in the sense of a Munich Academy might be, or even here in London, where you have the Royal College of Chelsea and you have the Goldsmith, and they're competing with each other all the time. In Düsseldorf, in the Academy, basically a Richter is not incongruent to Polke concerning teaching. They have a different field of battling each other.
So with the Becher students, perhaps the one who's closest to you is Thomas Ruff, who's been more sporadic in his approach to his practice, and, for example, has dealt a great deal with notions of perception, and has used newspaper photographs, and, as we've heard Jack Herzog speaking here, for example, has collaborated in the application of newspaper photographs to architecture in that way.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I have to say I'm closer to Andreas Gursky and Miles Coolidge, which happened to study there as well for some time. Maybe you have seen his series called Safetyville, where he photographed a town somewhere in California, which has been just built up in a smaller scale for children to get trained in traffic in the surrounding, which with everything like a gas station and a bank and everything, just a bit smaller to train them. So to those people, I'm kind of, and also Gursky now with his work where he kind of manipulates things with digital cameras. I would kind of define myself.
He's actually making sets and photographing them now as well, isn't he?
Yeah, it's a giving and a taking,
That specific history that you outline that academic history is obviously very interesting and crucial in some ways in the development of artists, but I wonder if you might agree that it can in some ways be misleading and can kind of fetishize the system over the artistic product. Around the time when the Becher School came to prominence, because the late 80s and early 90s, it was considered really in terms of objectivity, and if you looked at the earlier work of Andreas Gursky and of Thomas Ruff and Thomas Struth as well, it fit that quite easily. It was easy to link it back to the Bechers in a very clear way, and the way they've developed since seems to take it in quite different directions that play with objectivity, but with Gursky it's much more about, it's not about objective representation in any way, it's much more to do with staging, making a kind of arena for events to happen, and as you say, is turning that into purer fiction with his use of digital manipulation. With Ruff, similarly, he's getting into whole kind of hybrid notions of imagery, which again are a long way from those early beginnings. Do you think we can take too far that genealogy?
No. Whether I took it too far? Or
Can historians?
Well, historians do, and that was my point about the books and the writings in general have kind of classified so specifically the Becher school, and they seem to, Struth tries to alienate himself from being simply a Becher student because he studied under Richter and in the other Düsseldorf, one of the other Düsseldorf classes. But a lot of people seem to allow themselves to be constrained by reference to and that's very specific to this arena, it strikes me.
Yeah, but I mean, if there's a whole school and they kind of standing in the same field, like Struth was photographing museums, Gursky started doing that, and Ruff was photographing landscapes, and then Struth started photographing landscapes, and there's Axel Hütte which did everything a year before the other people, and Candida Höfer is there, which is kind of coming to closer to the other people's work as well, which doesn't say anything bad about them. It's just like they're all working in the same field, and this kind of concept of objectivity is a pure construction as well. It's not really. That's what you find out if you, as an artist, if you leave the whole, if you're not part of this circle, it's just it's a look, and it's an approach to the world, how they deal with it, which kind of you can trace further down from the Bechers, for example, to Rocher and a series of photographs he did of Sunset Boulevard or something like that, which have been playing a big role in the education of Mr. Becher. You see, so it's like there's a long ongoing development of one kind of giving the candle to the other, and as the Becher school went through all the institutional stages in the 80s, of course they all kind of diversified by now, because it carries you through a certain distance, but then nobody wants to see what Becher students are doing today. There's a spotlight coming on top of that and gave those people the possibility to explore different areas, but I think it's clearly Becher school is very, very easily to separate from other people's work.
Perhaps getting away from that, we could talk about some of the other issues which for me defined the exhibition. For example, a specific engagement by most of these artists with some notion of architecture or built environment or some notion of space, which obviously runs through, that's obviously what I've tried to suggest, runs through the work of all the people in this exhibition, and in a much wider ranging way as well, in a vast number of artists practicing photography in Germany. I wondered whether you have any ideas about why there is this very specific engagement with those sorts of issues amongst German artists, which seems to run back, from the post-war period, and obviously can be traced in photography in Germany to the Bauhaus and prior to that as well.
To be honest, I can't. I would even question the whole concept that it's a specific German thing. It's just like you can. It happens to be that a lot of German work is about architecture, but I don't think you can. I don't want to be part of some German movement or anything like that, because I don't think that's kind of carries you anywhere. Just like maybe a kind of inherent melancholy or sadness of how to picture things, which is basically a strong element of romanticism, and the romantic movement is has clearly played a big role in German art history. So maybe that is kind of how you can get things together then, but I don't think it's a specifically German thing, working with architecture.
If you can generalize, say, beyond architecture, what you can identify coming up in different ways in German art that obviously links with other places, but seems characteristic as a sort of mystique of the real. It comes up in this continuing use of documentary techniques turned to different purpose. But it also comes up in other people you've mentioned, like Martin Honert, who uses photography and makes sculptures that deviate in quite odd ways from the original. Or in Katharina Fritsch, who makes a cheese that's made out of some kind of synthetic material that looks more like a cheese than a cheese, or she makes a mouse that looks more like a mouse than a mouse, and that's quite psychological.
I don't want to pretend being a philosopher, but it's like that's kind of matching a kind of a Platonic idea of how, or idealistic idea how the world should look like if everything would be fine, and which led to certain developments in German history which are more than obvious. But I mean, this is like, this is a whole layout of thinking where you have a utopian, idealistic idea how the world should be if everything would be fine or something like that, which you hardly can find in France, for example, or Britain, I would say. It's complete. That is maybe a pattern.
You have a kind of ambivalent attitude towards that, because if you compare your work, which it can be in some ways, to Julian Opie's, the British artist Julian Opie, there's a similar kind of flat recreation of an existing scene, but whereas he would avoid any kind of detail and just go for planes and generalized shapes, also looking for some sort of platonic original. You have messy rooms, there's stuff and clutter in them, and then at the same time you resist detail. And I wonder where you in your mind draw the line between how much you're trying to recreate a scene and how much you're trying to generalize it.
It makes complete sense, but it's a pure practical thing. It would be very academic to kind of set up a rule. You go for as much as is necessary to make this place convincing, but not too much to kind of give you the illusion that you're kind of walking around in a Madame Tussauds environment. You just want to keep it exactly on the edge of being a signifier of a certain setting, but not the setting itself. I'm not reconstructing a space in the sense of a film set or something like that. It's just I want to keep it obvious for the let's call it good viewer that this is an illusion, but it provides you with everything you need just to kind of accept it as an image. So that's kind of, but there is no academic rule for that. I don't, in the end you just decide it like with your intuition, I have to say.
You say some or all of your constructions are life-size?
The architectural obviously are not, because a diving board in paper would be an amazing undertaking, but it's the size of the print is basically matching the size of the model. So if you have an interior space and it's kind of printed in life size, that's how it is made, and the diving board is exactly the size it has been printed, which is like 150 high.
I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear yours. Have you ever considered showing these as sculptures or as installations?
In the beginning, absolutely, because I didn't know really what the difference is, I have to say. But I mean, as a student, that's exactly what you have to find out as a student and resolve before doing that. And I just, from then onwards, I just did it once when in a show, the architecture of the show has been provided by another artist, Tiravanisha, and he promised me to make a space which is not accessible. So I assumed that maybe the setting I'm putting up there could provide me with the same distance of not being able to approach the setting, but knowing that it's there, like the photograph could do. But it didn't work out just for pure practical considerations in the end. Because in a museum you have security exits and everything, so if a child kind of manages to go in there and the building burns down, the firemen can't kind of rescue the child, and therefore everything is a disaster. So you just forget that.
Let's talk about that. What were the factors that made you move into making a moving image film in the tunnel? I saw that as a structure, it was quite a small scale sculpture.
Yeah, but that was a sketch. That was what I made to convince the Tate that it's worth paying for that.
So it was life size as well?
No, it wasn't life size, but it was 35 meters long, which is quite long. Right. So basically the idea came because I had the idea because if you have a space like that, which is completely virtual, and you look into the space and you can apply all the experiences of proportion of as a physical entity, you suddenly you're becoming very light, or something happens which is really it's like you entering a video game or something like that. And this experience I just wanted to it's an experience which is hardly translated into photography in the end. You just, for completely different reasons, you make this photograph and it's absolutely okay, but there is an element in there which I discovered after doing this for some years, which I wanted to put into the work as well. which is basically not to have a fixed position, rather than, I wanted to have a moving camera, enable the viewer to kind of look around in the space rather than having one perspective which is fixed, and that's only because I still consider them as in the first stage of the process of being a sculpture still, so, and then you develop it from there into photography, and that has kind of certain requirements and stuff, but still the first beginning is a three-dimensional setting in front of the camera. And then also like a tunnel, it basically is so simple. It's a very urban piece for me as well. And this is you don't have lots of buildings where you can drive through. So it's a very, very modern contemporary thing, driving through a tunnel. You don't, it's not landscape, nothing like that. It's just it's a container where you're sitting in and you're driving through another container, which is a very weird thing, I thought. I mean, after doing that, actually. So that's one of the things I just wanted to get elements of it into the work.
In terms of architecture, your work does have quite strong links to notions of utopian modernist architecture, which you seem to kind of play with and almost joke at in certain of the pieces that you. Is that an element that?
It's determinedly. I don't want to lay out everything. What is, because that's in the end of the role of the viewer as well. I mean, I can. I have different levels of meanings which I want to touch when I before I'm kind of when I decide to do a piece. So you have a lot of, like the staircase, for example, of the school. It's not, of course, not only my school. It's the manner how I picture it. It's like classic architectural photography, which you can trace down to Bauhaus photography, Moholy Notch, which I also kind of would pay some reference to in the case of the sink, because he was experimenting with those. Fiberglass sculptures, light sculptures, moving light kind of perspex things in the mid 20s. So in the case of the photograph of the staircase, as I said, I wanted to kind of reconstruct an image which you carry around in your head, like imagine a table or something like that. So imagine a staircase, how would it look like? And then you go through some ideas of staircases, and this popped up in my brain. But by doing some more research, it turned out that this school has been a post-war school. After the war, there was a commission coming together, deciding what kind of architecture is needed now for building schools in which the new citizens should be raised and educated, and the new citizens of Bundesrepublik should be better than the old one. They shouldn't be like some soldier mentality which says, whatever Kaiser says is right and we do it. We need democratically educated people. And obviously the language of architecture, which was like used in the Third Reich, which hasn't been developed by the Third Reich, was completely discredited. Can you say that? And the only other PC-like language of architecture was obviously the Bauhaus, because it went to exile. So you didn't have a lot of people available, because most of them were killed or made career in America, and they didn't want to go back and kind of do the aftermath. So the main assumption which kind of stays in behind that is, of course, that you kind of can, which is concerning maybe the Architecture Association as well, that you can, it's kind of questionable assumption whether you can raise better people in different architecture. So if you have like that if we all would live in modern buildings, that we would be happier and better people, and that kind of that's what Bauhaus architecture shares with Third Reich architecture, as well as any other architecture since the Enlightenment. But this is like a thing where it kind of, I'm walking on very thin ground, so I wouldn't like to make a book about it. It's just like saying that you kind of, if by exploring the traces of the image you're surveying, you find more and more reasons why it would make a lot of sense to do it.
Bill Gates and Jeffrey Dahmer seem to have lived in relatively similar surroundings. Would you want to draw any conclusions from that? No.
No, but there is a Jeffrey Dahmer kind of link, which is really interesting, because he thinks, as I said, that the pictures are the oil of the 21st century. Yep. And there's his big concurrent is Mr. Getty, who his picture archive is here in London, and Getty comes from a family which got rich by the oil of the 19th century, which is pure oil. So there are links in between power and money, obviously.
You talked about wanting to move around within an image. Somebody wants to ask a question. Can I?
Please finish. I will come after you.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about the odd similarity between the very low-tech work that you make, or the skilled work, and high-tech virtual image making through computers. The visual similarity is intense.
Striking, yeah.
Is it a comparison that you think of, and would you consider working in a way that didn't involve you constructing something with your hands?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning it was, I could have, lots of people said, why don't you do it on a computer, it's much easier. I don't think you kind of apply your experiences, your physical experiences from the real world onto computer screens that easily, that you as you do it on like settings, photograph settings, and that's I still want the image which is on the wall as a kind of a window into another, let's call it a reality, but it's of course not a reality. And the second thing is that if you kind of demystify the computer, it's just a very parallel process, but if you limit it to the possibilities of the computer software programmer, like the guy who made the software and all he could think of what it might be necessary in computer programs, and the whole technical aspect of it becomes so overwhelming that it might be, mystifies the whole work in a completely different direction, which I don't think is so interesting. I'm still working on images, and a software program works very similar to that, but it's like it's ending up in similar results, but you don't need to. It doesn't mean because a computer is like contemporary tool, you have to use the computer. And the system, what they do and what they start with is exactly the same. They're analyzing an object. This one is a geometric three-dimensional object basically, and whether you do it now you put it into a computer and show it on a screen, or print it out with a plotter or something like that, or whether you make a model, it's still the same idea, or it's still the same range of geometric forms. There's no invention in content there.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I wonder whether I could try to put an architectural perspective on the kind of work which you are discussing. And I guess for an architect, it is less the issues to do with artistic representation and what is real and what is not and so on, which are especially interesting. I think it's more something to do with the spaces which are represented seeming to an architect to be real. And I guess it ties up with, say, what Rem Koolhaas says about spaces, about generic spaces or the generic city and so on. And I would be interested to know not only aspects which are specific to Germany, about German history, about the choices of spaces to be photographed or represented, but also whether those spaces which are shown seem to be somehow right on of our time, and whether there is something very contemporary about spaces which are so disembodied, like, say, office space and so on. I mean, the question may be too direct, but anyway, that's the kind of thing which I would be interested to find out.
Is that aimed at Thomas? You're asking specifically whether the spaces are chosen by reference to what they are, by reference to their function.
Well, whether there is something which, say, perhaps Thomas de Man finds very contemporary about those spaces. I mean, all right, we can all recognize those office spaces, I guess, or we can all recognize this underpass, which we have been into, and somehow I do not get a sense from what has been said so far is that the fact that we can all recognize it is something which matters, yet to me this seems very much what makes the work interesting.
So the fact that they're generic? rather than being tied to the history, which
yes, I guess
he talks about.
At least from an architect's point of view.
I don't see the question in this. Is there a question? I mean, this is absolutely, you're absolutely right, but it's, you know, it's. I don't want to explain you my work in a way which kind of tells you why why I don't do the South Bank Center, for example, or something like that. I can't really talk about architecture in the sense you understand architecture. I'm just, you're surrounded by the results of your thinking, and you try to find your way through that. But I don't have an architectural utopia. In fact, it's I find them not very contemporary, those spaces. I find them very generic, and I find them very influential of your like self. How do you say, like you? It's they. As I said, they're coming from my memory basically, or like like the concept of a parking garage rather than a parking garage. But it's in contemporary architecture. I don't think you would build any parking garage like that anymore. That's not the point. So I can't really give you a statement about contemporary architecture, and also like if you see how if you have a look how art is normally displayed, they have a lot of problems with modern architecture. The more contemporary the architecture becomes, the less accessible for art it is. Which is a problem which it doesn't have to do with my work at all. It's just like if you do shows all the time, you for example, I'm supposed to do a show at Fondation Cartier, which is basically in Paris, which doesn't have any wall at all. So, which is absolutely fine. It's just like I don't think I have to do anything there. So, so it's, on the other hand, the whole building is for art, and then the question is what kind of idea of art the architect has, which doesn't mean that he has a bad idea, it's just a different idea. So you end up like fulfilling the idea of the architect by being an artist, and that's that critical point where I can only be an amateur and say, okay, I can't put a nail in the wall here. It's glass, but that's all, So I can't give you a statement of contemporary architecture, really.
But the fact is that most of the work emerges from a more specific historical, personal reference point, rather than being related to an architectural history, which perhaps is a most direct answer to the question.
It's really a continuation of the last question. One of the things that interests me is in the talk is what happens in between the archive and the generic, in the sense that you made a lot of reference to different kinds of archive as sources, as a kind of source, not literally maybe, but in some cases fairly literally. And yet, what results is a generic image which has therefore a very kind of ambiguous relation to the archive to which it refers, because in a sense it kind of destroys the specificity of anything that might be in an archive. And I wondered what the implications of that might be, or how you would think about that in relation to the work.
I think a lot about that, but I don't want to kind of provide you with like fantastic, enlightening revelations about the idea of storing images. But if you have a look around, you kind of presented with, I think there are more images or representations of the world than what we would call reality out there. So you're dealing every day with the representational, with kind of picturing the world rather than world. And if you've grown up I just kind of understand the world as being a fantastic example for what I have seen in the pictures firsthand. You see, so the whole kind of process of what the picture is as being a sample of the world is kind of reversed in the moment you have more pictures than world, basically. And if I kind of look into archives, it's the idea of my work is more a recycling, by saying, I try not to add too many more images. Like I try to kind of get first what we have already, and put it into a different context, or kind of at least get hold of it or make work out of it.
There's also the relation to memory as well, between being a sort of personal memory and a generic memory. Kind of what happens in between the two, where the generic memory becomes almost the memory of anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's important to you in terms of the way that you
but
see the spectator?
Otherwise it wouldn't work. I mean, I very carefully don't go to my school and have a look at the staircase, because the school is completely uninteresting in the end. It's not really the point. What anecdote is linked to the work. It's just for me the starting point. And in the end, I'm not interested in any of those fates which are depicted in the images. It's just the fact that that a tunnel is presented to me in all kind of angles where somebody has been killed for whatever reason as well, but it's still the tunnel which everybody can access, but it suddenly becomes a metaphysical space. Suddenly it becomes a place where something like a modern myth is created, and then this focus or this perspective on a very mundane environment, that's what interests me then in the whole thing, and whether I can kind of import it into imagery, whether I can kind of try to kind of lift off the first interest of news, kind of a news story or something like that, and have a look whether there's anything left underneath, so to say a second layer of an image or something like that, because I think actually that there's a whole story of it. Basically there are not so many images in the world, they kind of repeating themselves typologically in the end. So you want to kind of find them. Maybe you can contribute much more to that anyway.
I'm not going to use this thing. I wondered, Thomas, if I can ask you a bit more about that, about whether what you're saying about the banality, or the banality of the images are actually anchored by the narrative that you give them, like the picture of Bill Gates' room is a completely banal image. But by calling it Bill Gates' room, it has this aura, which the image itself doesn't necessarily.
But maybe I haven't mentioned that. Is that the title of the work is, for example, in this case, Corner. I never have a title which is really depicting the story, because as I said, I'm not really interested in the anecdote. I'm not really interested in the Madame Tussauds element of it. What I'm interested in is that somehow this weird place in mid-America, or like on the West Coast, finds its way to my eyes and is as good as a source as anything else in the world, as the apple on the table, as a conventional painter of the late 19th century would depict, or something like that. But it's as good as much as reality, and the whole media became some kind of landscape where you can walk through virtually. And your concept of reality is changing by that. That's what I said about having more pictures of the world than pictures. The whole idea of that's my it's like Thomas Demand world, but it's still you can see if you see it like that, you can see it everywhere, that the concept of reality is changing fundamentally. If you now since 10 years you go to restaurants which kind of this is a Western restaurant, so you have you're living in a set basically. You go to a set and having an experience of a Mexican restaurant with all the things of a Mexican restaurant. You have a Beetle, the new Beetle by Volkswagen looks like the old Beetle, but it's a new Beetle. So it's already shifting. It's not a car just to drive from A to B. It's an image of a car basically you're driving in. It's like a Puccini opera is a car or something. You have constantly cracking up the Verlässlichkeit, reliability of the reality you're living in is shifting constantly, and that's the whole fun of it as well. That's why they do it. It's not a disaster. It's just like you try to make sense of it. The assumptions which classic art of even minimalism is basing on, they all completely gone. There is no point on showing formal kind of for today is that there's no point on showing what the proportion is and the play in between different proportions, how it looks like in the end, because first hand it has been done, second hand the idea of art completely changed by now. This is not really an issue anymore. It's what an issue is, like is the concept of reality you're living in and how you find your way through it. For me, at least. I mean, I'm talking completely about me.
Does that put greater emphasis on the story rather than the image, if there is this kind of generic...
But that's what I want to say. I mean, if I would somebody called me once, and I say that not to impress you, it's just like, because I find it, there is an inner truth in this, which I really, in the end, don't understand, is like maybe something what I do is some kind of Donald Judd of photography, because it's really not about the story. It's about the fact that the images you kind of dealing with they have something else than the story, and that's what I'm working on. But by taking photographs which possibly people know and are familiar to people, or places which are familiar to people, like because we share all the same experiences, or whether it's this diving board or it's another diving board, doesn't really matter in the end. This is, you just kind of you show that there is more on an image than the story it tells. And that's basically what I'm trying to say.
It's a strategy that, although you handle it in a very particular way, isn't peculiar to you. I mean,
no, not at all.
The kind of phrase that Michael raised of the tension between the archive and the generic is pretty crucial to a lot of art of the past 10 or 20 years. If you look at Gerhard Richter, the whole Atlas project, this sort of sense of almost desperate recuperating of images, almost whatever they are, or Boltanski, or even of somebody like Rachel Whiteread, and the kind of absolutely exact replication of an image through casting and plaster, but then at the same time abstracting it and distancing it from the original narrative source. It's not an either-or thing. It's part of the play of making art.
One thing I would like to say, because we talked about Ruff, the idea of the last Ruff work is collage, and that comes back in a lot of architecture. I'm entertained with as amateur again, but it's like the collage is maybe the central motive of the last 10, 20 years, which is kind of basically the end of the century. Like rearranging the same thing, which is not really postmodern in the closest sense of postmodernity, postmodern kind of thinking. Anyway.
You referred repeatedly to German history and different phases of 20th century German history, and I'd just like to bring this up because perhaps quite a number of people in this country aren't aware how important German history is to contemporary German art and culture, literature in its widest sense. And it has to do with when one is defeated, one has another response to history than us here, who were the victors. One feels more guilt and greater tensions. I mean, that's just one aspect of the involvement with history. But it is evident in the way you presented yourself that these phases, like the DDR, before the collapse and after the collapse, these phases are of great significance in Germany, more so than anywhere else, and as you implied, affect art. And so the point I think we should draw from that is this: the weakness of art in this country today, this confusion, the concern with the obvious, with the surface, and the refusal to go into the politics of the present situation, the crisis in which the world exists, perhaps the greatest crisis ever in the history of humanity, has to do with this difference. You were the losers, therefore you have the tension, the necessity to struggle through, to understand, whereas here, apparently, there are no great problems, therefore art in this country can afford in quotation marks, not really, to be superficial, to play about and play the fool, etc.
I wouldn't like to take this responsibility on my kind of humble shoulders here, humble big efforts here, because for me it kind of struck me with a surprise when I came to London and I kind of settled down a bit, that nobody is depicting all this fantastic material coming up. Like in the 80s, they really tried to, like they dealt with it like a taboo or something. Do not touch anything of this. And it happened to be that in the 90s, suddenly people kind of, they dare to kind of approach issues like that again. Whenever I have to say that German art at the moment is not at its strongest, so everybody is a bit shaken and unsecure what happens next. But for me, sitting here in London and seeing the wall coming down in Berlin and all the consequences of that and stuff, it was like very surprising that nobody really wants to face it. I wouldn't say with any word that I can really struggle successfully with it, but it's there and you can't really go around it. All those issues of how Germany in this society tries to do the right thing by knowing that everybody watches all the time, and that's an amazing. My perspective is of course not the one of a loser. I really have to say, because I'm born in a different generation, and you're raised with in circumstances where you're told that you are the losers of the war, and you put into a setting where you can't, where it is becoming more and more fictitious. This whole reality in German society as well becomes more and more like, even now, if I remember the Bundesrepublik, it's like it has been like a century, not a century, but like really, it's a really nostalgia now about this, and it's just 10 years ago, therefore I just, I don't think I really succeed with kind of giving any answers to anything like that. It's just like I was very drawn to things like that, so maybe I'm more a medium than like a responsible driver in this area.
But I think what you said about your work and the points that you raised apply quite equally to many of the people in the exhibition and in the publication. The engagement with issues of history are very specific with many of these artists, and not solely with German history, but it's very much driven by that. A lot of these people, their work is driven by the notions of excavating their own histories, their personal histories, or the histories of other peoples, or by the use of photography and its relationship with architecture in most cases. And for me, that has been one of the driving opinions of the project.
What struck me though was that there were two classes of image. One to which a historical event was attached, and another to which the whole point was that there was nothing attached. So in one picture you accompany the picture with its sort of Vorgeschichte, its prehistory as it were, that this was Bill Gates's room, this was Hubbard's room, this was Hitler's room. Then we have a room where actually it was no one's room, it was nothing, it was just dishes in a sink. Or even if you remembered it, well, you remembered it, I could remember it, maybe someone could remember it, you don't remember it for any reason. So what I'm left with is a sense of the absolute nullity of the background reality of events. That sometimes an event happens and sometimes it doesn't happen, but that there is this setting which is, it's not simply generic in a kind of architectural way, it's just generic to reality.
I wouldn't like to change this kind of perception at all by saying anything against it. I may kind of, I understand my work, or let's say this really narrow, like ridiculous rules, like the dogma films from Sweden, for example, is a very similar thing as well. You just, or like an essay which has like ridiculous rules in the beginning, and somehow you succeed with going along with them, because it doesn't really matter what kind of rule you set in the beginning. It's like a chess game, and yeah, there are different moves possible, and I'm constantly trying to kind of develop new moves in this, and sometimes they don't mean anything, sometimes they mean quite a lot, but it's always about the model of understanding, or the concept of understanding the world by a media, which is photography in this sense. So I would say the model of the whole thing is the photography, not the not the model really, because the model doesn't really matter. But this is inherent in the way I'm working. That kind of completely evaluation of a very important picture and an absolutely blunt, mundane picture. But I can't, I don't want to give you any meaning on that.
Seems to be a kind of rather puritanical view emerging from the audience of where meaning lies. I mean, it's possible to pace your perception of meaning through a number of works. And when I mentioned Gerhard Richter, if you look at, just because it's the example that comes to mind, his series of paintings on the Baader-Meinhof members in prison, yes, there were some images of the members of the group in prison, and they had, historical significance, or there was a kind of armoured carrier moving into a courtyard. These were images of historical import. There was also a painting of a gramophone sitting in the corner, which had none. It's nothing. It's a sort of trivial observation, but cumulatively, it's an astonishing collective embodiment of a moment. And I think within that work too, it's almost precisely the way that significance or aura, I guess, transfers from an image that has a very specific history accounted for to something that doesn't. That's intriguing as art. It may not be good politics. It may not kind of get you anywhere, but I don't know that that's necessarily what we're after. And just getting back to the question or the point that we had before, not being British, I think I can stand up for the fact that not every British artist wants to play the fool, and many, we probably would recognise that there can be seriousness within foolishness as well. Just getting back to your point,
But what I was trying to get at was possibly the implication in this work of the impossibility of the photography of the event.
Yeah, but true. It's good that you say it, and I don't have to say it.
Alex?
Maybe elaborating on it, put it another way. I really enjoyed actually the blurring of the definition between reportage and fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy it a lot, but in your work I think left me wondering whether maybe sometimes media could be a client rather than the art. Well, I was wondering whether there's a possibility of media being interested in perhaps commissioning you to fabricate the scene of a crime before it had occurred in order to document it so that they could archive it. Have you ever been approached by media?
I have been approached by media, but never faking a crime, which hasn't been happened before. No, I think they need this essentially for the credibility. That's the whole point. But I mean, that's why I put the New York Times work in there, because I wanted to show that, in this case, the archive approached me and not me approaching the archive, which I rather enjoyed.
Were they interested in owning the work after you've made it? Were they interested in the work after you've made it?
Oh, they printed it and I got even a prize for that. They're fantastically happy with the whole thing. They just expected me being there and doing some footage on site, which.
They filed it in their archive along with their own.
Yeah, and it's part of the archive now. It's kind of entering the thing.
Perhaps one more, last one, Naomi?
I think Michael actually was about the difference between reconstructing and memory and whether if you're making one of those models from a photograph, it's quite a determined sort of mathematical procedure in a way, or so then how would you do that then if it was just something in your memory? Do you have memories that are very kind of...
No, you recreate them. It's like there's a fantastic book by Vladimir Nabokov, which is called Speak Memory, where he has a similar project in literature, where he tries to kind of recollect memories from his childhood and make them as precise as possible. Just sit there as a work, kind of trying to sit down and kind of recollect a complete picture of childhood. And then in the end, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, because if it's complete, it becomes a different reality, and that's what you deal. You know, I don't know what you see with my pictures anyway, and you know, this is for me not the point by making the work. But of course, you have necessities. Like, for example, the staircase doesn't have doors. Of course, there are doors, but that's not the point I want to make with the picture. I'm not interested in this really. I'm trying to kind of minimize it down to one central point of interest, and then really try to kind of reconstruct that one. And as I said, with the staircase, for example, if you check it afterwards about being true or not, it's very often not true at all. Which doesn't, you know, the image is out there. It doesn't really matter.
What about when you're reconstructing the space from a photograph?
Excuse me?
When you're reconstructing the space from a photograph, from an archive photograph, are those much more? Is there a kind of determined mathematical sort of?
It's not a reconstruction in the sense I just leave out lots of details. I never have any writing on the.
Is it almost a gridded space, kind of, I don't know, reversed out or something?
Yeah, but it's like, you know, it's like that big maybe, and it's just a beginning point, and you just kind of try to imagine a space from exactly that source. And then I tried several times to get the original photograph, and you trace them down. It's a story which is fantastic, what happened to images before they kind of came to the point where you found them. But you know, you try to find the photo album of an architect, and the architect died. He gave it to his assistant. The assistant gave it to a museum. The museum doesn't have it anymore, but they gave it to an editor, and the editor didn't give it back, and he moved out the building. Stuff is still in the building. You go and have a look underneath the staircase. There's a lot of files, and everything is there besides this one photograph. You see, so you do that, and it costs you like tons of time, and or like going to Milwaukee, standing in front of an empty site. You know, it's like happens all the time. But in the end, it's never the point really. It's never the point finding more than you had in the original photograph. Like the Ron Lafayette Hubbard, for example, I tried to kind of trace it down in LA because. It's a very interesting, it seemed to be very interesting to find out a bit more about it. And it's actually the fact that he, as a founder of a religion, didn't want to give lots of photographs out there. There's only 7 or 8 official photographs of Ron Lafayette Hubbard because he wanted to have complete control about his appearance in press after his death. And he had a big fight with his son, which wrote a book after the fight. They never spoke again. He wrote a book about the truth about Scientology and gave some family snapshots into the book to damage the image of his father in public, but still the image wasn't there again. And it went on like that, you know, ongoing struggle to find the image, and finally I called the magazine where I found it. It's called The Spiegel, and she wasn't allowed, explicitly, she wasn't allowed to give out the images, just more than, you know, the image is obviously much bigger than the cropping they did. And to get the idea, because I couldn't see what's happening on the left-hand side, which is not so interesting, she told me on the telephone what's on the image. So basically it's more a told story what's on the image than a real thing. So I call her back and I ask her, this box, is it there? Do you think it's something for Chinese food, you know? And she says, yeah, that could be. Maybe it's Chinese food stuff, you know, and that's how things coming together, and then you have a complete image in the end. But it doesn't have necessarily to do a lot with the original source. I mean, it is. If you put them next to each other, it's matching it, but it's becoming an ideal place more than really like an idealistic version of the place than a real reconstruction.
I'd like to thank Greg Hilty, in particular Thomas Demond. Thank you all for coming as well. Thank you.